Which brings us to our next topic here. Yeah. Let's bring this story from the LA Times.
Well, here it is.
On the screen.
Here it is. This is what we're talking about. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop.
The U.S. is investigating 2 more Mexican governors for connections to cartels. The U.S. is investigating 2 prominent Mexican governors, multiple sources said, as the Trump administration expands its campaign against... I saw there's a cat. Hold on, we got it. She's always here.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
All right. The U.S. is investigating 2 prominent Mexican governors. The move against sitting government officials threatens to undermine Mexico's ruling party, which came onto power on a promise of combat corruption and further strain the already tense relationship between the 2 countries. For years, the U.S. refrained from investigating sitting politicians in its fight against drug trafficking, preferring to target cartel leaders. But as many of Mexico's most notorious drug traffickers have been killed, arrested, or have turned themselves in, Washington has shifted its attention to prosecuting elected leaders and law enforcement agents suspected of involvement in organized crime. And who are the 2 governors? It's Alfonso Durazo of Sonora and Americo Villarreal Anaya of Tamaulipas, both of which are border states, of course. And according to the New York Times, the sources that spoke to them, they've already been stripped of their U.S. visas as a result of these so-called criminal probes.
Which both governors deny. They say they still have their visas. Both of their offices have come out and said they denied that. Because the LA Times is conveniently saying that they don't have their visas, but they're still allowed to cross the border because they're basically cooperating with grand juries.
Yes, that is the argument. I was just going to mention that.
Yeah.
So here we have it. Yet again, 2 sitting governors now in the eye of the very politicized, not at all justice department.
Oh, yeah, it's not at all politicized. Very autonomous and very objective. And only concerned with justice.
Yeah,
of course.
I mean, this is clearly an escalation, right? And it happens after a very tense meeting, shall we say, with high-level U.S. officials with the Mexican president.
Yeah, and
so I don't think this is terribly surprising.
And with after this Sunday speech,
they're
trying to slap her down after the Sunday speech,
and after this kind of
the change
exchange with Ron Johnson.
That change of right. And that, hardening of tone from the president didn't just happen on Sunday. It's been happening progressively in the mañaneras over the course of the last several weeks, little by little. Sunday was a culmination of a hardening of tone over the last several weeks. That must be noted. Right? And what's so rich about this is that, especially in the case of Villarreal, Villarreal was the first Morena governor of Tamaulipas, replacing one of the most corrupt governors in the history of Mexico, which is Garcia Cabeza de Vaca, who is in Texas right now, comfortably living on a ranch, I think in McAllen, and the United States refuses to extradite him.
That's right.
Talking about extraditions. So why don't you extradite Cabeza de Vaca? No, they want to go after Villarreal because it's political.
That's what
so clear.
Is.
It's so clear.
It's so clearly political. This is their effort to intervene. This is exactly what Sheinbaum was warning about.
Yeah, not the laundry list of PRI governors from the Peña Nieto years. Right? They haven't been touched.
Yeah, and let's go back to the counterterrorism strategy, because I think this is yet another piece of evidence that we can add to my suspicion that this is precisely about trying to depict the Mexican government as being complicit with organized crime, of protecting governors who are in cahoots with organized crime, according to these allegations, in order to justify unilateral military aggression. Which we know they're capable of because they've done it before in Venezuela, because they've done it in Ecuador. They just reached an agreement with Guatemala. They're pressuring Honduras to do it as part of a broader strategy to pressure Mexico. And because we know that they're threatening to militarily attack Cuba. Why would Mexico be an exception? I don't think it would be. These are not, we're not playing by the usual rules before, where at least there was a semblance of respect for a country's autonomy and sovereignty. No. This is clearly yet another escalation by the United States to turn the screws, to try to put pressure on the government, to try to get them to concede, yes, on security, cooperation, which, as the president said on Sunday, this stops being cooperation when you start interfering the way that they are.
Clearly.
But also around economic matters. We have to remember that officially the negotiations around the USMCA, the TEMEC, as it's called here in Mexico, have begun. And they want it all, right? They don't care about Mexico. They don't care about drug trafficking. They don't care about corruption. What they care about is resources and labor power. And they're trying to position Mexico as essentially a protectorate that can be used and abused to the whims of the needs of the U.S. ruling class. As simple as that.
It is
And they will
simple.
pull out all the stops to do it, including these politicized kinds of investigations against sitting politicians. Maybe these allegations are true, right? We should let justice play out. Justice in Mexico, of course. I don't trust the United States anymore ever since, well, ever. But I think in particular after they pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez. But the point is that this is clearly an effort to intervene. There's no actual interest in securing justice here.
And it's funny, too, if you mentioned all the countries, other countries in Latin America where the United States is intervening. If you're following the case of Brazil, which is really interesting because it has elections in October, the Trump administration declared 2 organized crime groups as FTOs, obviously as an attempt to use that as a pretext to intervene more before the elections. And it's just such the exact same dynamic of Mexico. You have the son of Jair Bolsonaro, who trundles off to Washington to beg the Trump administration to do this, and the Trump administration does it. And what does Fabio Bolsonaro get? He gets his little picture next to Trump in the Oval Office desk, like a little poodle, right? Same guy who asked Trump to tariff his own country, the tarifaço in Brazil, right? So there you are, really. And what the United States hates, and just to finish on this because it's very important, the United States hates the fact that Brazil has set up its own payment system called PIX. P-I-X, public and no commission for transfer money, which takes money away from their payment systems. Right? So what they want,
and the control,
and the
right?
control
Like the U.S. having controls over these transaction systems.
Sometimes it's not as much the commissions; it's all the transaction history goes through Wall Street.
Well, and they can coerce governments this way, right?
That's
back when Biden was negotiating with Maduro, one of the things they promised him, we'll let you back into the SWIFT system. Right? The SWIFT system is basically, except for like kind of the Russian alternative that exists now, it's the only way to do international transfers, right? And the U.S. controls it, so they leverage that control for their geopolitical aims.
And so even, a fledgling system like PIX, which is popular in Brazil because it works and it's quick and it's free and all that raises the shackles in Washington.
Now, why did Cody never take off here in Mexico? We have the same system set up by the Bank of Mexico. But no one uses it.
It didn't work. Nobody uses it. Good question. Good question. I don't think part of it, maybe the system itself, I think they kind of didn't promote it that much because they didn't want to make who angry. And then, if those things don't take off quickly, they die. And instead everybody uses these Mercado Pago terminals, which takes a commission and all the rest of it. So we're paying Mercado Pago.
You made a post actually recently about some data around Mexican banks basically not serving working class people,
this is a whole other story, and we should do a whole segment on this maybe next week. But this has been a long-standing problem with Mexico, which is a huge economy, but it has one of the worst lending rates of all of Latin America. Right, because there's a cartel in the economic sense of a few,
a
real cartel,
a strict definition of the term,
or a strict definition of the term, of foreign-owned banks, all save one, that live on a rentier system. They collect rents in the form of commissions, quotas, penalties, and the like, and they make a killing in that. They make more here than in their home countries. So why would they want to lend to people? Why would they want to bother lending to people if they can just be a rentier system?
They make all their money off of the fees and stuff.
So it's a real problem. I went in just very quickly, anecdotally, to ask about getting a mortgage just to see. And I went out of there like I could never, ever do that. I think the monthly payment they were going to ask was more than I make. I mean, it's out of control.
Not to mention they usually ask for 20 or 30% down payment.
Who
can save that much?
Right. It's just like, I now make a reasonable salary. I didn't for a long time. I now couldn't do a mortgage here. Not even close. Not even. And I know people in the United States are facing this, but the mortgage rates are that much higher in Mexico, like double. Right. And that's just one example of what small businesses and pymes and MIPYMEs and even medium sized and even larger businesses always complain about. You can't get credit in this country, and that's what chokes off. Right. That's what chokes off growth. And there's a whole. I think we could have a whole discussion too about kind of the whole rentier aspect of the Mexican bourgeoisie as well. Right? They just kind of they don't do anything but collect rents. That's all they do. Yeah. So it's part of the larger Mexican system at large. But that for another day.
An interesting point before we move on to our next topic here. According to the LA Times reporting, at that same meeting, the one where we were just talking about, Mark Wayne Mullen with Scheinbaum, told the Trump administration told Scheinbaum that the Trump administration expects Mexico to send Rocha Moya to the U.S.
Yeah, that's what I said. And I think she pushed back on that in that meeting, and that's why they went out of there with those glum looks. Yep.
U.S. officials, though, have little faith that Rocha Moya or any other politicians will be convicted in Mexican courts. So not only that, but also undermining faith in the justice system. Perhaps that's why we had so much noise around the judicial reform.
Yep, exactly. Right.
It's part of a longer-term strategy.
And what's interesting, too, is, everyone always impugns the Mexican justice system. It's the U.S. justice system that has to be under question here. Because what they do is they click their fingers and demand extraditions with no proof because they know that they're going to base or attempt to base their prosecutions on, he said, she said, he said, witness testimony. Okay? When there is a huge incentive to perjure oneself in that, because they're always doing it in exchange for plea bargains or reduced sentences or witness protection or the like, right? Which is why the U.S. won't extradite. It's why the U.S. won't extradite, right? The Scheinbaum administration has made this point abundantly clear. 269 extradition requests made by Mexico to the United States since 2018. The United States has not extradited anyone. Not one person. And they could say, oh, we don't trust the Mexican justice system, right? Mexican justice system has its flaws, but so does the U.S. justice system. They're just different flaws. They're different flaws, right? And the incentive to say what prosecutors want is massive for these people. And there's no way to prove perjury, right? So why did they not provide proof to Rocha Moya? Maybe they're just arrogant and said, we don't have to give you any proof. Maybe they don't have proof yet because they rushed the case after Chihuahua. They just rushed it out to punish and to distract attention from the case. Or maybe it's like the Cienfuegos case where they didn't have it. Or they didn't provide Mexico anything because they know they're going to be basing themselves on future testimony from the Chapitos and from the two people from the Sinaloa government that have turned themselves in and under what circumstances were else. So they have nothing to give yet because their case is based on the future testimony.
Right. And worth remembering, what is the long-term vision here? Mm-hmm. They want to undermine credibility in Scheinbaum's mandate. Mm-hmm. The idea is that she is tainted by these same allegations of politically damage Morena, Scheinbaum as much as possible. We have to remember here in Mexico we have 6-year terms. She's still here for another 4 more years. And the midterms come up not this year, but next year, right? To try to undermine that support, to try to damage one of the governments, one of the few remaining governments in the region that is willing to stand up to the United States in its effort to undermine sovereignty in the region. It's that simple. And I think one final thing before we move on to our next topic I want to say is that I do think with this latest escalation in particular, that it's time for this rhetoric to turn into action. Maybe some restraints need to be put on Ron Johnson to make it clear that you're overstepping.
Should be out of here. Should be gone.
Yeah.
But they're not going to do that.
Maybe. I mean, if he continues to interfere, I don't see it as an impossibility that he be ejected. He can't be doing what he's doing. Constantly, which involves, I remind you, infiltrating CIA agents into the country. I don't doubt for a second Ron Johnson was involved with that.
Do you think does anybody in their right mind think he wasn't?
Exactly.
CIA Ron, does anybody think he wasn't?
So I think it's time to send a signal.